It's about shaming someone who's enjoying a rare moment of watching a toxic person get real consequences. These reactions are human. And yet, for some reason, the tendency is to let the toxic narcissistic person keep getting away with it while the rest of us are being told to be the bigger person. Let's talk about, today, let's talk about the things that narcissistic enablers say. This is a series on understanding the things they say. And have you ever had someone say this to you? Like, they just can't help themselves. Don't let it bother you. This series is meant to help you understand the things that enablers say, because in many ways, the harm that enablers do is at the same level of what narcissists do. Now, enablers actually do a lot of their damage by sort of laughing and minimizing the foibles of narcissistic people. They'll say, yeah, that one. They really do come out and say it. They'll say like, oh, that guy, Johnny, he just can't help himself. He just does some crazy stuff or says some crazy stuff, or they just do what they do, making all that noise. They just can't help themselves. It's a bit bigger than just the idea of not having a filter, something we've talked about. It's almost like they are eternal jokesters or provocateurs. Their enablers truly believe they can't help themselves. This, to me, is really an enabling around the classically narcissistic idea of impulsivity. And impulsivity is a central piece of narcissism and other high conflict personality styles. This idea that someone just can't help themselves is actually so wrong on multiple levels. Unless someone has had some kind of frontal lobe injury or disease or other brain injury that stops them from inhibiting themselves, people can help themselves. And if they don't, then they're making a choice. Now, lots of narcissistic folks get by on being sort of the cut-up, the class clown, the joker, the irreverent comic, the dark humorist. They'll deadpan say things that are actually quite mean and may then sort of flash an artificial smile. So I once knew a guy like this. He would say things like, I actually sometimes need to gouge my ears out so to not hear the ignorance around me. And then he'd give this, again, that weird smile. I think he thought of himself as this clever, smart, deadpan, dark humor, flat emotion, cool guy. I just stopped working with him. Now, because telling jokes or being funny can get validation, admiration, attention, trying to play situations for laughs, even in a cruel way, is often a narcissistic person's MO. And when their humor actually hurts someone, maybe, just maybe, they might make apologies, but mostly they get enabled by the they can't help themselves enabling brigade, and they get to keep getting away with it. Sometimes the enablers toss it's just who they are on top as a clincher, as sort of like an enabling part too. Now, narcissistic people also get attention by doing outlandish, risky, and sometimes over-the-top pranks, stunts, or attention-seeking nonsense. Cannonballing, for example, into a swimming pool during a formal dinner party, or wearing something inappropriate to someone's wedding, or belching loudly during a religious service. Many narcissistic people are perpetual 4-year-olds, forever trying to get their parents' or other adults' attention by doing whatever is the equivalent of cartwheeling through the living room and jumping up and down to be noticed. They will do stunts or pranks that can be disruptive and dangerous. And while practical jokes can sometimes be fun and funny, they can also cross a line to the hurtful, and that is where the narcissistic folks will often go. The lack of empathy means that as long as they get the laughs and the adulation, who cares if someone got hurt or publicly shamed? It's all in the name of them getting their narcissistic supply. And it often gets to the hurtful place because the narcissistic person keeps escalating to get a rise out of other people. This can be thought of as a sort of form of baiting. I'm going to keep getting more and more outlandish until I get someone worked up, and then I've won because I broke their composure. And the enablers will just normalize that sequence and that escalation by saying, oh, come on now, don't let it bother you. They can't help it. Some of what happens can be sort of polarizing, divisive, or political prattle. These days, honestly, talking politics with anyone is dangerous business. Now, one thing I have noticed in narcissistic folks is that when they hold opinions that are clearly in opposition to someone who they have encountered, that even when it is not apropos of the conversation or the event or just sort of the situation, they will still say something inflammatory. It can be enraging what they say and really quite antagonistic. And invariably, as people are getting angry, the enablers will say, oh, come on now, don't let them get your goat. They just can't help it. Yes, they can help it. They're just being a you-know-what. And again, it also is baiting. If you really want to break a narcissist, just don't take their bait. Stay calm, stay serene, don't engage, they will escalate, you won't respond, and then after a while they just sort of get frustrated. Now, and the enablers just prop up this entire tent circus by saying, oh, they can't help themselves. This is of little solace to those unfortunate enough to be on the receiving side of these pranks, jokes, and jests, and who may end up having to look ridiculous or have something that's important to them interrupted or ruined, or just to be the butt of a joke that they didn't ask for. And if you, as the butt of the joke, complain or raise concerns about the inappropriateness of it, you are more likely to hear statements from the enablers and the narcissists like how you're a spoil sport, or you're a buzzkill, or get over it, or stop being so sensitive. And then they'll back that up with, oh, come on now, they aren't that bad. You know how he is. He just can't help himself. People can help themselves because, frankly, if they cannot help themselves, then we've got a much bigger problem with that person. Such a person who truly cannot help themselves is not only a public health danger, they may be a danger to themselves and may not be able to stop themselves from any impulsive behavior. Let's stop letting people off the hook by saying they can't help themselves, because in the grand transactional universe that narcissistic personalities live in, basically, they are willing to trade on people's hurt to ensure they get validation. They can help themselves, and letting them get away with that by saying that they can't is exactly what keeps these behaviors in place. Over and over again, people keep saying to me, why is this getting worse? Why does it feel like there are more toxic, difficult people out there? I'll tell you why. Because the enabling is getting worse. And all these little throwaway statements like, they can't help themselves, each of these just end up throwing another log on the fire on this real epidemic of toxic behavior that's taking a toll on all of us. Let's start here. A person writes unkind social media posts about you and then is really angry and passive-aggressive with you, and even keeps insulting you at a party in front of other people, but sort of in this sort of subtle, giving you a little dig here and there way. You're really getting exasperated. You've been through this over and over again with this person, and you sit next to a friend and explain it to them, and they say, yeah, I see it. We all see it. I see how they're behaving. Ugh, you know how it is. That's how they are. They get worked up when other people get attention, and you're getting a lot of attention now. Come on now. All right, I get it. Can't you just be the bigger person? So, has anyone ever said that to you as you were trying to navigate the difficult, treacherous territory, or just trying to deal with the narcissist? If anyone has ever said this to you, drop that in the comments. Have you ever been told that you need to be the bigger person after it is you being invalidated, abused, and otherwise mistreated? Now, there are lots of scenarios that could raise this comment of a third party telling you to be the bigger person. I don't know, maybe you said, listen, I want to show the narcissist, I want to show them these text messages and show them the evidence of their gaslighting. Maybe you want to file a complaint against someone so there's real consequences against a narcissist, I don't know, in the workplace or a neighbor or something like that. Or you want to ensure that someone who has behaved in an abusive manner gets real consequences to their behavior, or that someone who has abused a contract faces the financial penalties because they really kind of screwed you over. Or you decide to not show up to an event where there will be someone in attendance who in the past has been verbally abusive to you. Or maybe you even say, upon hearing a story, that you hear a story that the narcissistic person you know actually got some significant consequences against their behavior. You say something like, oh my gosh, they deserved it. Karma, yay, they finally got called out. You may want to or have done one of those things and then are told by other people to be the bigger person. I gotta tell you, I've certainly had this happen to me, and I've definitely heard about it happening to other people. It's one of the most enably of the enably tricks in the world. It's basically telling someone to be the bigger person is basically shaming someone for having a normal emotion or normal reaction or for wanting real consequences. It's about shaming someone who's enjoying a rare moment of watching a toxic person get real consequences. These reactions are human. And yet, for some reason, the tendency is to let the toxic narcissistic person keep getting away with it while the rest of us are being told to be the bigger person. To be told to be the so-called bigger person actually means that society or the people around you are in essence telling you to shut down your normal emotional responses, to forget the bad things that the narcissistic person did, and frankly, to set you up for more abuse. Because in being the so-called bigger person, you don't say anything, and you may continue to interact with this person, right? So you're really sort of putting yourself in harm's way because you continue to have to deal with the narcissistic person and are often compelled or feel like you're supposed to act like nothing happened. Their behavior was fine and not have any behavioral consequence on the narcissistic person's behavior and just put up with their behavior because apparently that is what it means to be the bigger person. Now, many times it appears that to the people who use this bigger person language, that being the bigger person means that they expect you to actually take the bait when the narcissistic person baits you. If you don't take the bait, as we all know, what does a narcissistic person do? They get really frustrated and they get worked up, right? So it's as though the enablers in your midst want you to take the bait so the narcissistic person doesn't tantrum or get upset. Yeah, I don't think so. So when people who tell you to be the bigger person put that out there, it's interesting to really reflect on what they mean. Obviously, to be the bigger person is by implication to not sink to the level of the toxic, manipulative behavior of the narcissistic person, or to not get lost in the schadenfreude of it all, to not rub it in and perhaps take the childish stance of saying, I told you so. So in a way, it's an admission that the narcissistic person's behavior really sucks because you're being told to not be like them, but also being shown, and maybe it's this sort of strange societal acceptance, that there's never going to be any real accountability for the narcissistic person's behavior. It's basically a manipulative trick to maintain the status quo. I have witnessed people be silenced for years because they were told by everyone around them to be the bigger person. Or they internalized that message to be that bigger person because that was sort of being implicitly communicated around them. And because the people around the narcissistic person were silenced for years, the narcissistic person that's in everyone's midst just got more and more and more emboldened because nobody was holding them to a standard. Everyone was trying to be the bigger person. Now, another problem with being the so-called bigger person is that it really limits your ability to successfully set and maintain boundaries, to maintain radical acceptance or realistic expectations. And being asked to be the bigger person is basically enabler speak for don't do those things because we don't want to upset the angry, fragile, narcissistic person. Somewhere along the line, just giving in and going along with difficult people and not holding them responsible for their behavior qualified as being the bigger person. Frankly, to be the so-called bigger person implies that in essence, you're not being petty, right? That's really what it's implying. To not do the small-minded things that the other person, usually a narcissistic person, is doing. But if the other person, the narcissistic person, is they're only petty, because that's what they do, being petty is a very narcissistic ground game, then basically it is impossible to be in a relationship with them because it's basically like being in a relationship with a child or a very constantly petty person. Being the so-called bigger person doesn't really get to the goal of ever addressing the narcissistic person's behavior. And it's fair, it's probably there's no point in addressing their behavior, right? It just keeps things the way they are. So that begs the question, though, of whether there are alternatives. And maybe there are. Number one, stop caring what other people think. I know that's hard, but we've all got to stop. Most people want to maintain the status quo, even if it means toxic people behave more toxic or do more harm, right? Nobody wants to upset the apple cart. So to break this cycle means that you stop caring about the people around you urging you to be the bigger person, which is merely their way of avoiding the narcissistic person's wrath. Number two, take a page out of Dr. Maya Angelou's playbook. Once someone shows you who they really are, believe them. Believe them! Interestingly, giving a person second chances over and over again in our society is often viewed as being the bigger person. It's really not. It's basically the equivalent of taking a psychological sucker bet over and over again. Once a person shows you who they are, believe them. And don't keep offering up second chances. Adjust your behavior to the expectation of this person's limitations, or just stop interacting with them if that is an option. Number three, don't engage. You know, that's a favorite of mine. I recognize that if you disengage, I almost promise you that that will leave other people around you saying that you aren't being the bigger person. Go back to point one that I just made. You got to not care as much about what other people think, especially the enablers. But it all goes back to my beloved deep technique. Don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, don't personalize. Don't engage might be one of the most important steps in this. Keep it trim, slim, and tight when you're interacting with narcissistic people. And when they bait, disengage and step away, as hard as that may be. Number four, don't try to convert the people who are telling you to be the bigger person. Don't try to bring them around to your way of thinking. They are enablers, and they are often as entrenched and difficult and rigid as the narcissists. Let them keep their enabling narratives and build some boundaries around them as well. If they're so worried about people being the bigger person, let them be the so-called bigger person. Perhaps if you disengage and you no longer are willing to sit there and be the narcissistic person's punching bag, those enablers are going to have to step into that role, aren't they? Let's see how good they are at being the bigger person then. Love to see you drop a comment. What's one thing that you've done to address narcissistic people's behavior? And more importantly, were you called out for not being the bigger person when you did that? I am frankly sick and tired of watching people who have been through narcissistic abuse or people who have had to deal with lots of toxic people who then turn around and further devalue themselves by suggesting that they themselves are not being the bigger person when they choose to take actions that protect themselves. Protecting yourself and safeguarding your boundaries and mental health is just about the biggest person thing that you can do. Don't fall, please don't fall for this moralistic old trick of calling you out to be the bigger person and further enable the narcissistic person's abusive behavior. The reason that the narcissistic person and other toxic people are getting away with so much these days is because the rest of us who actually do have empathy and compassion are so concerned with being the bigger person. The fact that most of us have not gone to full volume and called out these people who gaslight us and invalidate us on the daily, as far as I'm concerned, that restraint makes us nothing short of giants. If you're surviving one of these relationships with even a little bit of grace, you're big enough. Don't sacrifice yourself, don't take their bait, and don't engage. Now, has anyone ever said this about a narcissist in your life? Oh, come on now, he's just brutally honest. Now, I've talked about this. I've talked about this as an excuse narcissists make for themselves. Again, this is a sort of the enabler version of, I'm just speaking my truth. Or in fact, the narcissistic people themselves will just say, I'm brutally honest. Which again, like I said, I know I've done a video on this that by now you've likely heard. This is different. Now, basically, narcissistic enablers are looking for that path forward to keep supporting the narcissists and their agendas. But more than that, it's less that they're all about the narcissist, it's that the enablers want to maintain the status quo for themselves. And this, oh, they're just brutally honest, is an enabling statement that we often see happening in families, couples, workplaces, and friendships. Now, after the narcissist says something cruel or critical or just plain mean, the enablers will hit back with, oh, come on now, they're just brutally honest. There's this trope out there in the world that people who are willing to be painfully honest possess some kind of bold virtue. That if a person's willing to take the risk and be horribly honest, then somehow that is courageous, and perhaps they are doing some kind of good thing for the unfortunate individual on the receiving end of this brutal honesty. Enablers will also lump this under things like tough love. There are times all of us face a moment when we want to tell someone something that's not very pleasant. For example, that maybe a friend picks out a wedding dress or some other dress that's not flattering, or their partner is cheating on them, or that they don't have a chance at getting the job that they want to get. And sometimes we do step up and say it. And sometimes we take the path of believing that this isn't worth burning down the relationship. Obviously, it's going to vary situation to situation. To share information that's honest but potentially hurtful is very difficult. In fact, it's a healthy person's empathy, self-awareness, compassion, and kindness that often stop them from sharing feedback that is highly unpleasant. And yes, I am aware that what could also be playing a part here is cowardice or fear of losing the friendship or not wanting to be the executioner. All of those are also reasons that people hold back about telling sort of hard truths. They figure let the person learn on their own. That's not necessarily a bad thing. However, when we're armed with mindfulness and compassion, there may also be another way to deliver news. Instead of, that wedding dress looks awful on you, or there's no way in hell you're getting that job, who do you think you are? We could try alternative approaches, such as like, hey, how about you try on lots of looks? It'll be super fun to watch you do that, and we just rank them together. Or let's talk about the pros and cons of that job, and also some other options just in case. There are, in fact, gentle, collaborative ways to nudge people to viewing other perspectives. And ultimately, if they still are resistant to our feedback, it's their lesson to learn, right? But this video is really about the enabler's gambit to suggest that being cruel or saying things in an unnecessarily cruel way is just brutal honesty. The unfiltered, impulsive, unempathic, non-self-reflective manner of narcissistic communication means that inevitably people's feelings get hurt by them. And sometimes the person affected might speak to the enabler, who then chalks up the hurtful way that the information was delivered to just being, he's just brutally honest. All of us, whether we're narcissistic or not, are capable of brutal honesty. I've done it. You've done it. It happens. Sometimes we have to speak to an unpleasant truth. We have to speak an unpleasant truth to someone. And in general, it doesn't feel very good afterwards, but maybe we feel we need to do it to keep someone safe or protect them from much worse consequences. It may have been necessary in that circumstance. But for most healthy people, it's not a regular occurrence to share really intense, brutal truths, right? The regular unfiltered tendency, though, of a narcissistic person to say what they want, when they want, because they're so impulsive, it happens quite regularly for them. It can easily be minimized with them always telling everyone the truth as simply being brutal honesty, when in fact what it really is unnecessary cruelty, deliberate unkindness, and it happens far too often. This isn't a rare event that for regular people would be delivering painful but necessary feedback. This so-called brutal honesty may be a daily occurrence. I've talked with many, many people who had parents who were often termed brutally honest by other people. These folks had recollections of a childhood characterized by dismissive criticism, cruel jabs about their abilities, about their appearance, about their weight, by unkind comparisons to siblings or other children. The enablers in the family system may have tried to write off this unnecessary and cruel communication as brutal honesty. But it was far, far more than just that. And the child who doesn't know to question the parent and wouldn't feel that they could question the parent and may keep trying to please the unpleasable parent will hear from the family enablers that their parent is just brutally honest. But for a child to hear that it is honest means that there may actually be truth to what the parent is saying. So it's actually a very harmful precedent. This, enabling kind of branding on narcissism, that they're just a person who says it like it is, that they're courageous and honest for speaking their truth. It does a lot of damage to the people who are in the crosshairs of this so-called brutal honesty. Honesty, like most important things in life, does not need to be brutal. There is always a more reasonable, intentional, and compassionate way forward. The enablers, in fact, are the ones who are the least honest with themselves and are willing to throw you under the bus to maintain their illusions about the people and the situations around them. So when an enabler tries to invoke this idea of, that narcissist, they're just brutally honest, recognize the game they're trying to play and start setting boundaries, not just around the narcissistic person, but around the enablers as well. let's talk about a phrase that has really been bothering me lately, because people keep using it, and it's talking about someone narcissistic. It's often in the workplace. It can sometimes be in a family. And the way they enable a person, they say, let's just humor him, or let's just humor her, or let's just humor them. Okay, so it's let's just humor whomever. So let's talk about that, because I'll tell you why it bothers me. Let's just humor them, or him or her, is code for let's waste time listening to this person's rambling because we don't want to take them on and set a boundary with them and ask them to please stop. To please stop behaving this way, to please stop hijacking the meeting, and on and on and on. I would love to hear from any of you. If you want to drop it in the comments here, how many of you have ever been in a meeting or a family situation like this where you just let a person keep getting away with stuff under the let's just humor him? Now, the funny thing about let's just humor him or her or whatever, let's just humor them, I'm going to use that to make it easier, is that in a way it's somewhat demeaning, right? You're saying you're humoring someone is that you're not really listening to them, right? You're like, okay, we're just going to let them go on and on and on for a while, and then we're going to do it the way we were going to do it. So that in a way it is actually kind of patronizing and insulting and demeaning. I get that part of it. But there's also a part of it that's deeply enabling. Because when you keep saying, let's just humor them, this person, this very difficult, toxic, or narcissistic person, gets to keep holding court. And it is a waste of time. It is a waste of resource. And what it also does is it squelches the expression of other people's ideas. Because you're humoring this really difficult person and letting them go on and on and on and on, then what ends up happening is you've now wasted other people's time, which is really devaluing the most important resource most of us have. I remember once being in a meeting, a particularly toxic dude in this meeting, like, oh my gosh, awful. And he would do a lot of this. You know, I do. And it would be like, are you serious? He's lying back in his chair practically, takes his time, speaks loudly, speaks slowly. And when I went to the person running the meeting saying, do you see how much time we're wasting here? The person running the meeting said, well, you know, he's used to people just sort of taking the time to listen to him, so let's just humor him. My head exploded. I was so incensed because everyone else was being kept on a schedule. Maybe they had 2 to 3 minutes at the most to express, 1 minute to express the very important thoughts. And most of them were actually bringing something to the table. Instead, this dude was going on 5-6 minutes, all like this, taking his time, speaking very slowly and deliberately, saying nothing. And it was so disrespectful. My strategy ended up being using the restroom at that time. When he'd start talking, I'd start peeing. Because, not in the room, obviously, but I would actually leave. And because I really felt like my presence there, listening to him, I was almost passively enabling this behavior. Listen, once in a while, let's say you have a person coming in one time, sure, okay, get him in, get him out. But this was this is a regular group of people that would come together. And in fact, this person's views were actually really quite awful. They were not very much in line with the mission and vision of this particular organization, and on and on and on. So this let's just humor them does become a soft pedal way of enabling. It's often used by institutions. It can often be used in families. We're in an interesting time of year now, right? Holidays and all of that, where you often have to sit and break bread with people. Maybe not as much this year because of all that's going on in the world, but maybe even if you have to Zoom call the dinner, with your family or whatever, and the person's going on and on and on. Everyone's like, just humor him. But this just humoring is sometimes why for decades, entire generations get impacted by this kind of conduct. And so I think that it's not actually that humorous. And maybe somebody has to be the one who finally says, you know, I'm not humoring this anymore. In some ways people deal with this is actually literally putting timers on things, saying, you've got 2 minutes to talk, and when the timer goes off, you're done, next person. Now, when you do that to the let's just humor in person, they'll be like, ah, really? Really? We're going to be so rigid with time? Ironically, they'd have no problem putting a timer on someone else. So let's talk a little bit about discernment, and more specifically, because it's such an important tool, let's talk about people being shamed for being discerning. The most central tool to protecting yourself from a narcissistic relationship, and yet you're shamed for it. Let's break that down. So, things that survivors will sometimes say to themselves, especially after they've been through it and learned a little bit about narcissism. They may say, I'm being too fussy, or it's not realistic for me to expect so much of other people, or if I keep being this choosy, I'm going to end up alone. Discernment is one of the key tools in managing narcissism in your life. If done correctly, it can be a brilliant tool to keep them at bay, not let them in too far, set boundaries, and cut your losses early. It's a tough tool, especially if you are empathic, because for reasons of things like cognitive dissonance, socialization, a history of trauma bonding, and invalidating relationships, the tendency is to make excuses when you meet a narcissistic person early on, and even, honestly, after you know them for a while. But it's not that simple. What's even worse is that other people may shame you for being discerning. They may tell you that you're being too fussy, that you can't expect so much of people, or that if you keep doing this, you're going to end up being alone. Or they will even get in a dig like, oh, so you're so perfect, huh? So in essence, you get shamed for noticing red flags and wanting to disconnect, set boundaries, or distance. Now, I find that discernment, something I preach, is great in theory, but it can get quite thorny in practice. I myself have had lots of problems with it. I'll meet someone, they'll seem toxic, I'll distance, and then people have said to me everything from, Ramani, you're not a team player, to you have to give people a chance, to even when I don't say one thing, all I do is distance. Oh, Ramani, you think everyone's a narcissist, don't you? Yes, and they say it in that voice. Now that narcissism survival is a primary focus of my work, I've stopped caring what people say and think. But back in the day when those voices mattered to me, I would think to myself, sometimes on a bad day I still do, I'm a horrible person. I'm a witch. Maybe I'm the narcissist for taking this stand of discernment. And this negative messaging was mirrored by the numerous trauma-bonded relationships that I've had. But if you are going to be discerning, sadly, in some ways you've got to sort of tolerate the shaming, which means developing some pretty thick psychological calluses. So when people tell you that you're being fussy or that you're going to die alone, then you have to do some second-level discernment and ask yourself if the people issuing you those criticisms, if they're enablers, and you got to erect some boundaries around them too. There are some tricks to discernment, though. It's really hard to cancel the script inside your head that you are the one being difficult by being discerning. That's the work of slowly addressing trauma-bonded patterns, not confusing empathy with enduring abuse. That's not easy work. Now, when it comes to other people, one place to start is to not tell other people that you're doing this kind of discernment initially. Just bow out, distance, set a boundary, perhaps acknowledge that you're busy or don't have the time. Because when you share red flag detection and discernment with other people, they can be judgy. I think the idea of discernment may make people nervous because they are concerned that they could be flagged as a sort of a red flag person. And my advice to anyone, and the simplest advice, is literally the simplest advice in the world, is don't be an asshole. Like if everyone remembered that, a hell of a world. Also, what can be helpful is to look back at some situations when you were discerning, but still were able to know how that person was behaving in various situations. So then you could see that those red flags you detected early, those things that left you feeling uncomfortable, were a thing. In one of my more recent experiences of this in my life, it became apparent that someone I had met very, very quickly was toxic inside of 3 minutes of meeting him. He was absolutely awful. And I was viewed as a not nice person for avoiding him. I never even said anything about him. I just avoided him. I wouldn't work in small groups with him. I wouldn't even want to be seated next to him at dinner. His behavior was always awful. But everyone kept saying that no matter how different we are, we can all work together, kumbaya nonsense. It became a battle of tolerating the idea that I was being viewed as a difficult person, but this person really was. Then that toxic person, after a few years, emboldened by everyone cutting him a wide berth, did a really bad thing. It caused all kinds of problems. It wasn't even that it felt good that I was right, maybe a little bit, but the issue did hurt people, but it really taught me how difficult discernment is. I just had to be resolute and tolerate being unpopular. Whether we do discernment quietly and then shame ourselves, I'm fussy, I'm being uppity, or others shame us, who do you think you are, glass houses, all of that. The best tool, discernment, is one of the most difficult to use. But that doesn't mean you can't use it. Use discernment quietly. Again, reflect on that tiger's cage metaphor I've shared. If you have to test the waters by walking into the cage, you may get shredded up a bit, but then at least you tested the hypothesis, and it kind of confirms that you were right in your instincts. Discernment doesn't mean that you have to turn on your heel and walk away. It doesn't mean that you have to share with others that you think this new person is toxic. It means trusting yourself for a minute, moving slowly, taking a minute, setting boundaries, and not waiting for other people to sign off on your decision. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, so many survivors, have been gaslighted for so long and infused with a false narrative about themselves. You're the one who is the problem, right? That when people tell you that you're the one with the problem, you start to tend to believe them. If we wait for everyone to sign off on our choices around disengaging a little, setting boundaries, stepping away, then I have to tell you, none of us are ever going to get out of these relationships. You're never going to get full consensus. If you are more discerning, I can promise you, you're probably not going to be popular, but you'll definitely be happier. Thanks again.